Welcome back. Now that you already have some paint on your paper, let's learn some ways to manipulate it to make beautiful paintings. There are 3 techniques that I think are important to learn at this stage. One is glazing, one is charging, and one is lifting paint. Let's get started. As we work on a painting, there are going to be many different times when we want to have a color have some variety to it, not just be all one color like a flat wash, but rather have some shading or some nuance or have some dark parts and some light parts. And there's several ways for us to do that. The first possible way is called glazing, and all that really means is layering your paint. If I do a glazed painting, I could start with one layer. In fact, I think I'm just going to start with a medium wash of ultramarine blue, cover the whole paper, and now I'm going to let that dry. Part of the glazing process is that you have to have each layer be dry or it doesn't work. So let's put down a first layer that's a medium blue. Okay, we've let our first layer, our first glazed layer dry, and it's dried to a medium ultramarine color. I'm going to now get more pigment on my brush, and over the top of this layer, I'm going to put another layer. And this layer is going to be darker. I'll put a little mountain in there. And again, it's just another wash, another flat wash actually. It's not graded. It's a wash of blue that's a little bit darker than that first glaze. Now I need to let this layer dry. Once my second glazed layer is dry, I can load up my brush for a third layer, this time with even more pigment. It doesn't have to be in this order. You could glaze layers of very, very similar amounts of pigment. Each time it's going to subtly change the layer that you've started with. Now I've got a pretty well loaded brush, so this will be probably darker. I'm doing this partly so you can see the difference in my layering process. Now this layer is over the top of that mountain layer, the second one. Just give this a little bit more pigment so it's even darker. And I have a little bit of a landscape painting here that has 3 different tones to it. It's got 3 different values of ultramarine blue, lighter, medium, and dark. But the only way that that worked without having it just turn into a big mess is because I let each layer dry before I put the next one over it. Let's look at a way that we could use glazing, not so much for the whole landscape, but for an individual feature or an individual object in the landscape. And it might give you a little more of an idea of how this might work. If I were to paint a tree using a glazing technique, I might start with a fairly medium amount of blue paint. I'm going to start with a large 1-inch flat brush at the bottom of my tree. And it's going to taper upwards, getting smaller as it goes up. So after I get past that first thick part of the trunk, probably want to switch over maybe to a round brush and keep my pigment amount about the same. I would start to put some branches on here. They're going to get smaller as they go up. Okay, this is enough to give you an idea, and I might put a little bit of grass down here or whatever. I'm going to let this dry, and let's see what we'll do if we glaze this. Okay, so I've let this first layer of glazed tree dry, and now I'm going to go back into it a little bit and think about some light hitting it. And let's pretend that the sun is coming over from this right-hand side, casting most of the left-hand side of the tree in shadow. I'm going to put another layer of paint over on this side where it's darker, where the sun is not hitting it and it's in shadow. Might have a little bit of almost little bark ridges showing on that side of the tree. I could carry that all the way up this branch, all the way up the side of this branch. So this branch needs a little more thickness as it joins together there. I just continue like putting that shadow line on the side of the tree that's away from the light, away from the light source. The other thing I'm throwing in here a little bit is a little bit of suggestion that the tree is round, which I can do with by adding these little curves to the paint. Let's see if I can show you what I mean on this branch right here. If I put little partial circular shapes. That'll tend to have people see that as a curved surface. And then finally, let's just hit this last branch. And again, I want this to be pretty dark on that side that's away from my light. Okay? That would be a way that I might think about painting a tree using glazing. And I could certainly need to add some more branches to this. But generally, it's kind of like adding shadowing and depth and making it a little bit more interesting and a little more 3D. Remember, I had to let that first layer of the tree dry before I glazed the darker shade.
Well, you made a very, very happy little tree.
Glazing colors is something that watercolor has in common with a lot of art mediums like oil painting or acrylic painting, because in all of those mediums, you can put various layers of paint down, let them dry and put another layer over or glaze a layer over it. But something that watercolor can do that's very unique is it can let colors blend together while they're wet on your paper right in front of your very eyes. And that's called charging one color into another color. You take one pigment on your paper and you charge in some drops of another pigment. Let's see if we can do that with our tree. Instead of making the shadows and the three-dimensionality of it come across by using a glazed shadow line later after the original painting was dry, I'm going to try to do the whole deal while it's wet. And I'm going to start with some sepia, and I'll make a little puddle of sepia paint here, which is a brown that I love. It's a pretty rich, earthy brown. And I'm going to start down at the base of my tree, and I'm going to grow my tree up this way. Okay, we'll do this more with a round brush in a second, but I really want quite a bit of pigment and water on this part of the tree, okay, that I've done. I'm using my flat, 1-inch flat brush, but I just use that one edge of it to make a fairly thin branch. Okay, so this tree is still wet, but while it's wet, I'm going to charge in some Prussian blue. I'm going to get my round brush full of Prussian blue, and just over on this edge, let's run some Prussian blue in there and let that sepia and Prussian blue start to work together. In some spots here, I want to give some clean water to this because my sepia had started already to dry a bit, and I want that to kind of encourage it to flow, that Prussian blue to flow across. A little bit of clean water, just getting that charged pigment to shoot across that painting and make some interesting blends of colors. Use this round brush to throw some thinner branches in up here. Okay, let's just see what we got going here. I've got one color, this sepia color, and it's coming together with Prussian blue. They're both wet, they're both flowing, and when they start to do a little dance together there, you're going to find some interesting things that happen that's a little bit out of your control, but that's where the serendipity happens, and you can end up having some wonderful surprises that will make your painting really sing. So far, all of these basic strokes have been ways for us to put paint onto our paper. But now it's important for us to think about ways that we can take the paint back off of our paper. Let's talk about lifting. We're going to set up a little PlayStation for ourselves here, a little experiment on how to lift paint back off of our paper once it's down. It's an important way to be able to change, manipulate, or adjust what you've done, and also it's a great way to have some variety in a field of color. I'm going to start with some clean water and get my paper pretty wet first. I think wet in wet will help us understand this the best. So we will get our paper wet. I'm going to go both directions on my clean water. And now I'm going to take a loaded 1-inch flat brush, load it up with ultramarine, and do our flat wash basically, although it's a wet in wet flat wash. I'm going to add some pigment with each stroke, go back the other direction, overlap my strokes. And now I've got a pretty wet blue sky here. Let's pretend that this is our sky. You can keep playing with that a little bit. It's got some grace to it now because the paper is really pretty wet. Okay. Once you've got a sky that you're okay with, let's think about how to put some clouds into it. First of all, you could take a facial tissue, I crumple it up, and I just touch that wet paint, and it's going to lift the paint back off and put it onto my tissue. If I crumple this in a way that would simulate a cumulus cloud, I could touch it more like a painter where I'm actually trying to create a cloud. And I'd like you to just play around with a tissue and a flat wash that's pretty wet, and notice that you can get some variety even within your cloud, some wispy light parts that are still lightly blue, and then some parts towards the center that are more hardcore white. You've really lifted out quite a bit of that pigment. Play around with a wet flat wash and a tissue. I'm going to throw in another element, and that is a paper towel. It's very similar. I find that I can usually get even more interesting textures with a paper towel than with a tissue, although it's a little bit less absorbing. Almost see some line work in there, or some geometric shapes based on the wrinkles in my paper towel. Get a super crumply one. So practice, play around, and create some clouds after you've already painted the blue of the sky. There's another way that we can lift paint off the paper besides paper towels or a tissue, and that is to use our brush. So I'd like to do again what we just did, and that is create a very juicy flat wash of blue. I'm going to use wet and wet again, so I'm putting clean water on my paper now. I'm going to go horizontally and then vertically so that I pretty well cover that whole surface. Now I'm going to load up my 1-inch flat with some ultramarine. Getting it reloaded, I should say, with pigment on each pass. Well, I got some pigment right into that wash there. That's because I did not really stir long enough or slowly enough. I needed to go back and forth on my palette, remember, and create that puddle. And I kind of took a shortcut, tried to go too quickly. Okay, so I have a juicy, wet, blue field of ultramarine that I can play around with. We already know that we could take a tissue now and create a cloud, but I want you to do some practicing with a flat 1-inch brush. I'm going to clean off my brush really well in clean water, wipe it on the edge of the water bucket, and now I'll take this brush and just blot some of that water out of those bristles. So it's pretty dry. It's still moist, but it's dried out. It doesn't have a whole bunch of water loaded into this brush. I call this a thirsty brush. It's ready for a drink. It can suck things up. So when I draw this across my paper, it's actually sucking up pigment. That's one way I could lift. Notice I could have painted sort of a cloud on there with a thirsty brush. What I typically do for a sky with a thirsty brush is I put sort of like jet streams or long, more stratus clouds across the sky rather than cumulus clouds. So I'm going to rinse it again in real clean water, just get most of that water out, pat it on a paper towel, and now draw it across my sky where the bristles are more lined up. I can twist it and turn. That's really sucking up a lot of pigment. The reason it's getting so much pigment is because I've got those bristles all lined up, and one after the other, they're taking their turn sucking up more pigment. If I just twist my brush as I go across, I can make a pretty nice looking cloud that's more like a stratus cloud or more long and horizontal. And that might make my painting really work. We'll talk a lot about those as we work on full-sized paintings. So there's another way that you can lift paint. So by now, I hope you've had time to practice glazing, charging, and lifting. Before we move on, there's one more thing I think we should cover. See you in the next lesson. Hi, I'm Bob. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you'll go by my website at watercolorwithbob.com. That's where you'll find an interactive outline of the whole course. You can also share your work with me and your fellow students. One thing I really love about watercolor is how accessible it is. That's why I realized it was important to me to put this course out for free. That said, it would mean the world to me if you would support this work. You can like it, you could share it with your friends, you could subscribe to the channel, you could also visit the gift shop or even make a donation. Thanks so much. See you on the next lesson, and happy painting. There's always hope on the horizon. You could still make a painting out of this.